Hello again, this is Aaron Jerome from Jerome Electronics. It's time for another video, a short one again this time. It's going to be about 7-segment displays and the mystical magic that makes them work. We're listening to the instrumental of a song called Stardust by an artist named Mika, who a lot of people think he's the next Freddie Mercury. I think he's got a lot of impressive skills. Great vocal range, tonal clarity, energy, charisma, and he's a great composer. So, look him up. I like to focus this time on the instrumental. I just like to hear what music sounds like. So, anyway, also my voice is a little lower this time. I wish it was always this low, but I guess I'm feeling under the weather. I don't feel bad, but my voice is obviously different, and hopefully that doesn't throw you off too much. So anyway, let's get into it. Seven-segment displays. As we go through this, I generally have a worksheet for my students to work on, and this is the worksheet that I'm going to give them so that they can understand how 7-segment displays work. I don't generally show this next slide. This is actually a piece of the homework, the worksheet. I'm going to have them do this, and I just thought I would include it this time. I do have separate worksheets for most of my videos, most of my presentations, and this is one of them. So 7-segment display, I usually joke around and say, can anybody explain the mystery of why we call it a 7-segment display? But really, it's because they have 7 segments, and these segments work together to make numbers and stuff, symbols. I like to show this picture, especially that watch, because it's been a long time since I've seen glowing wires used as 7-segment displays. I think I had a calculator, I'm going to give my age here, way back in the 70s when consumer calculators came out. I had one that had these wire displays on it. Cost me all of $14. It could add, subtract, multiply, and divide, and we'll be talking about that calculator and showing it a little later on in one of my later presentations. So anyway, these are 7-segment displays. This is probably, actually, these are LEDs, but they are formed into 7-segment display sections. So you might see a true 7-segment display at a gas station. These are true 7-segment displays here. Finally, the price of gas has gone down. Actually, these are high prices, unless you're in California or Hawaii. But currently, right now, as I make this video, I'm paying $2.27 for fuel. It's like, what is it? It's an election year? Why are prices going down so low? So anyway, 7-segment displays. This is kind of what they look like. This is how they're used. We might have an assignment where we actually take a physical 7-segment display and plug it into a breadboard and use it that way. But generally, specifically, what we're going to do is make a decoder from binary coded decimal, and I'm going to have the students make a decoder that decodes that into decimal and use a 7-segment display in the simulator. We use multisim. But I want to talk a little bit first about what does it mean, but what does common cathode mean, what does common anode mean, and I maybe could use some corrections here, but I think I've got this down. So let's talk about that. There's this guy. This is Ben Franklin. And back in 1852, he was quite interested in learning more about electricity. And from looking around on the internet, it looks like he was flying a kite in the rain, and he had a hemp string on his kite. And the string, when it got wet, was more conductive. And he wasn't actually struck by lightning, from what I can tell, but electricity did flow down through the string, and he captured it in a capacitor, which is what back then they called it a Leyden jar. And so he was able to get electricity. The interesting thing was, when he captured electricity and when he was messing around with learning about electricity, he noticed that a spark traveled. He noticed that lightning traveled from up in the clouds and down to the earth, and he began to think about what direction is that spark flowing? That was the real question. So he was thinking about electrons, and so his question was, do electrons flow toward positive or toward negative? Now, we know the answer today, but he didn't know it then, but that's only two directions. So he was thinking, well, there's a 50-50 chance. And if I guess right, I'll be the person who declared it. I'll look way cool. And so he thought that he would weigh in on the issue. And I would imagine that he probably published it in his newspaper. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, and he said, listen up, y'all. Electrons flow from positive to negative. So there it is. He's locked in his bet. And then 45 years later, there was another guy that came by, and this guy's name was J.J. Thomson, and he was here. He was experimenting with cathode ray tubes, which really are electron guns. You can actually shoot electrons in a specific direction with a cathode ray tube. And from his experimentation with the cathode ray tube, he realized that old Ben Franklin had bet on the wrong horse. And he said, nope, electrons flow from negative to positive. Ben Franklin, if he were alive at the time, would have said, are you sure? And of course, J.J. Thomson would have said, yes, positive. So, Ben Franklin was wrong. The problem here is that a lot of electronics books were written after Ben Franklin had made that statement, and a lot of tests and a lot of things had happened, and our culture and society had decided that Ben was right until J.J. Thomson came along and messed everything up. But now we know that Ben Franklin's wrong decision is called conventional current flow, and it's used most often. In my class, I still teach it the wrong direction. And I have to explain that that is conventional current flow, and that electrons actually flow from negative to positive. And so that direction is called true current flow. And what that means is that electrons, if you have a battery, the electrons are actually flowing out of the negative side through the components and back into the positive side. It's like a little bit like the battery being a generator is working like a vacuum. It's actually pulling the electrons. So when we use something like a generator to pull electrons, it's actually pulling electrons out of the ground and pulling them through components, if we're talking about the true current flow. Now, there is some argument that the conventional current flow is not necessarily wrong, and it still works as a, metaphor, because something is flowing from positive to negative. If you think about it, I've heard it explained as the electrons have to fill holes in the atoms, and the holes actually appear to flow the other direction, and it doesn't really matter which direction what is flowing, because it works whether or not we consider the flow to be from positive to negative or negative to positive. But I find it really important to know the true current flow, especially if I'm troubleshooting, because sometimes if you follow the current flow and you find where it is actually deviating or not working, then it makes a lot of sense in my mind to realize that the electrons are flowing the true direction. And it can be a little confusing with conventional current flow. So anyway, that's important because what I'm about to talk about is based on conventional current flow and not the true flow. So now today, in addition to the electron ray tube or the cathode ray tubes, we have a lot of different components that we can use. For example, diodes, they're one-way valves. This is a schematic symbol representing a diode, and notice it has a black arrow on it, and that arrow is actually pointing the direction of the flow of current, but it's the flow of current according to Ben Franklin. It's the conventional flow direction. True flow would be the other direction. The red arrows mean that it is a light-emitting diode. So this is a schematic of a light-emitting diode, and LEDs are light-emitting diodes, and they only allow electrons to flow in one direction. So I want to give anode and cathode very specific definitions. Anode, that is a path from the power source. I tell my students, if you want to keep these anode and cathode terms straight, when you think of anode, just think that means connects to power. And cathode, on the other hand, is connects to the ground. It is defined as the path to the ground. It is, however, conventional current flow that we're talking about when we talk about cathodes and anodes. Now, those terms are going to come to play here in this video, and that's why I am talking about that. So here we are back with the diodes, and we're back to 7-segment displays, and I'm going to show you the deep, dark, mystical, magical Jedi secrets of 7-segment displays. So to make a 7-segment display, we need some LEDs. And what we do is we arrange those LEDs in the shape of an 8. And we might have one more off to the side there. And then we put some connection pins on there so we can plug it into a proto board or plug it into a circuit board or a motherboard or whatever we're going to do with this thing. And these pins don't have to be pointing out to the left side. They can be above and below, or both above and below, or from the back and from, different directions. But in this case, I think it makes most sense to put the pins onto the left side. And we label these pins A, B, C, D, E, F, G, D, P, and ground. Now, if you have the worksheet with all of the 7-segment displays on it, the first one should be labeled as which segments go to which pin. And so the symbols here, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, D, P, and ground, are in this order for that reason, and it'll make more sense here in a minute, but all the LEDs are going to share the same ground. So GND, that stands for ground. I'm going to wire this up so that all of these LEDs share a common ground. There they go. All 8 of them are sharing a common ground. Now, if the same ground, if it is the same ground, if they're sharing a ground, this is also known and referred to as a common ground. And there's another name, common cathode, which is why we've been talking about cathodes. And of course, cathode means hook it to the ground, connect it to the ground. So this is a common cathode. And I tell my students, we call it a common cathode. CC, cathode is spelled with a C, but I joke around with my students and I say, we could abbreviate this as CC, but then students would understand what we're talking about. So just to make sure that students are sufficiently confused, the world standard is to label this or abbreviate this as CK. So we're going to put a CK on here. And the next thing we do is hook up each one of the LEDs to one of the power pins. So there's A. So label that on your worksheet there. Label the top. They're always the same direction and labeled the same. That top one is LED A. B is over on the right side. In fact, what's going on is we're wiring them up in clockwise directions. So C would be the next one, and D would be the bottom one, E there, lower left side, F on the upper left side, G is the middle one, and of course the decimal point. DP stands for decimal point. Did I say that? I don't think I said that. DP stands for decimal point, and decimal point's not really that important, so I tend to ignore it a little bit, even though I keep the pin there for it. Then we will put all of this in a box with some windows on the box, and we'll turn it over and fill the back with a clear glue, and that is pretty much the common cathode 7-segment display and what it is. And so there it is, 7-segment display. And and we can turn different segments on to make different symbols. If you haven't labeled that first one with A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, decimal point and ground, you probably should do that now. Pause the video if you need more time. I'm going to hook this 7-segment display up to power and to ground. First the ground. Oh, and we're going to be using some switches. So I guess before the ground, SPDT, single pole double throw switches. Now, we could just have on-off switches, but there's a reason we use single pole double throw in electronics, and that is to relieve any built-up pressure so we don't get a false signal. We're going to use them here. Going to need 8 of them. And then I'm going to hook them to ground. And so when these switches are flipped downward, it relieves any pressure that might be in the lines. Hooking it up now to power, flipping the switch upward should pressurize the lines, and then we can use the switches to cause electricity to flow. I'm now going to take the other end of each of these little SPDT switches and connect them to the different segments. And the ground is common. Remember, the ground is common, so the pressure will drain through ground, and there it goes. We're draining the pressure through the ground. Okay, so now I've just pressurized the input of the SPDTs, and so now I'm going to flip switch A, and when I do, it will pressurize that line, and when it's pressurized, the segment A will come on. That is segment A, and if you haven't labeled the segments as what symbol they are, A, B, C, D, E, F, and G going clockwise around, do that now on the first 7-segment display on your worksheet. Okay, so there's A. Bit of a problem though with A. Of course, it drains through the ground, but there's a bit of a problem with A, and this is what it is. We just burned out segment A, and the reason is that we've just given it 5 volts, and LEDs, they don't like 5 volts. They like to have about half that, 2.5, maybe a little more voltage to make them brighter and a little less voltage to make them dimmer. So we're going to have to do something to reduce that 5 volts down to about half of that, and so we're going to have to put resistors on each one of the lines. So there's a resistor. Now this resistor is the wrong resistor. I hate to admit that. It should be orange, orange, black if I'm not mistaken. I'm attempting to put a 330 ohm resistor on here, and that should reduce the voltage down to where we need it to be. So that will take it down to approximately 2.5 volts. We can do the math and figure that out, but that's basically what we want. And so we need a resistor for segment A, but we're going to need a resistor for all of the segments. You can't just put a resistor on the ground and make it work. We're going to have to reduce the power, so the resistors have to be before the inputs. Okay, so now we've got that, and there's segment A, and I can turn the switch off and depressurize the line, and go to B, and there's B, and if you haven't labeled these already, these are the segment labels and the direction they go clockwise around the 7-segment display. And as we pressurize each one, we get the different segments to turn on. And so here is F, and this next one is G, and of course the decimal point as well. We can turn the decimal point on, and so we can actually send messages by symbols. We can. I've had students get really excited about this and make banks of 7-segment displays so that they could spell words and so forth. But that's basically how a 7-segment display works. And so now we are going to use the rest of the symbols on your worksheet to It's actually self-explanatory, but what I'm hoping you'll do, and I'm hoping you'll work ahead of me on this, is to shade in the segments for numbers 0 through 9. You've got a separate 7-segment display for each one of the numbers. And I'd like you to only write the symbols on the pins that are used to turn the segments on, and then shade and label each of the segments that come on for each number. For example, to make a 0, we're going to have to use A and B and C and D and E and F and not G. Okay, G would make an 8. So on your paper, you would have listed A, B, C, D, E, and F, and you would label them, the segments themselves as well, even though I didn't. Now, there is a question about the number 1. I'm going to turn off the segments that I don't need. And notice that the 1 is on the right side. It doesn't belong on the left. The standard is that, the convention standard, whatever you want to call it, is that the 1 is generally on the right side. So hopefully you've done that. If you need to pause the video, I'm going to kind of go through these a little bit fast and then move on. But if you can predict each one of these numbers before I do, then you have proven to yourself that you understand what's going on here. Number 1 is on the right side. Okay, number 2, we're going to be using A, then B, then G, then E, then D. I didn't state that alphabetically. I kind of followed the path to make a 2 from top to bottom. But it is A, B, D, E, and G. To make a 3, you're going to need A and B and C and D, but not E or F, but you'll need G. Making a 4. To make a 4, we're going to be using segments B, C, F, and G. That makes the number 4. How do we make a 5? 5 is basically a backwards 2. We're going to need A and F and G and C and D, or A, C, D, F, G. We don't need B and we don't need E for a 5. Number 6, when we make a 6, all we have to do is add the segment E. There it is. Okay, but I want to point out that a 6 it's making use of segment A. I tell students 6 has a cap on it and 9 has a shoe on it. And there are times when I will prevent that from happening, but generally 6 has that cap on the top and 9 has a line on the bottom. 6 uses A, 9 uses D. We'll see a 9 here in a minute, but here's a 7. That's an easy one because it is just using segments A, B, and C. So 8, of course, uses all of the segments, and hopefully you have had a moment to shade those in on your worksheet paper. 9 also uses all the segments except for E, so to make a 9, I'm going to shut that off. And now you can see that 9 is actually using segment D down at the bottom there, and that is the tradition that 9s have that segment on the bottom, although in real life sometimes you see a 9 without it. Okay, so this is true for all CK, common cathode displays. This is how they work. It's very intuitive, makes a lot of sense, and that's it. But we should point out before we finish here that that CKs aren't the only 7-segment displays. There are also CAs. Common cathode means common ground, and common anode means common power. So for this is another illustration, a schematic of a common cathode, and you notice that the ground pins are in a slightly different position, but the ground does connect to all of the 7-segment displays. So there's a common cathode. In comparison, here is a common anode, and it's not that much different, but there are some important differences. First of all, with a common anode, you're powering every one of the LEDs, but they will not shine unless you ground them. So we put the switch on the ground. Note the polarities on these are in opposite directions. That matters. And if you put them in backwards, they don't work. So common ground or common cathode is this style, and common power, common anode, is that style. Now, what happens if you accidentally wire up a common cathode, but you use a common anode 7-segment display, or vice versa, or wire it, thinking that you have one and you use the other? So a common cathode display will make these numbers. If you accidentally put a common anode in place of a common cathode, what it's going to do is it's going to light up the segments that you didn't intend. For example, it will light up the green ones instead of the red ones here. Hopefully you can see those colors okay. So if I intended to use a common cathode and get these numbers, but I accidentally put a common anode in, it would look more like this. And I'm pointing this out because this is a distinct pattern that my students see quite often. And then I say, you know what? Those look like the negative segments. That dash would be a 0. That E, that backwards 3, would be a 1. And those lines all represent 2, 3, 4, 5, and so forth. And that is kind of how you troubleshoot. Did I use the wrong display, or did I wire them thinking one direction and getting another direction? So that makes sense. You can make decimal digits 0 through 9 with 7-segment displays. You can make a few alphabetic characters with 7-segment displays. There's a few, let me point out, there's a few that cannot be made. X, R, Z, W. There's quite a few that can't be made, but there are enough that you can actually make simple messages with these, and maybe you've seen these simple messages. Okay, with that said, what I want my students to do is, this is actually a worksheet that I've reformatted, so the instructions are easy to see here in PowerPoint. They are in a different place. The words are in a different place, as you will see on the second slide in that had this. What we're going to do is in the simulator, multi-sim for us, we're going to wire up a 7-segment display. And we're going to do it from scratch. My students have gotten used to using what we call the template or the bus of switches and lights to make this circuit, but it's not going to work because that's only got 4 bus lines, and we're going to need switches, and it's just constructed differently, so don't use the template for this one. For switches, you're going to search SPDT, single pole double throw. For the display, the standard basic garden variety red one is going to be, you search it by searching 7_seg_com_k. And I don't care if you use different colors, that's fine as well, but the red one is the one I'm using here. I do tell my students, because I have a hard time seeing yellow sometimes, and I don't like clear, it's I have a thing about using red, green, blue, orange. Those are okay. If you need to find a resistor, it's slightly different. You'll need to set your group to basic, and then in family, click on resistor. There are other ways to find resistors, but I find these are the easiest. Then search for 330 in the components, and if you accidentally click the wrong one, you can actually change the resistance of the resistor, but we're going to need 330. Don't accidentally use 330K ohms or 330 micro ohms. Make sure it's true 330 ohms. Sometimes that is a little bit too much resistance. If that doesn't work very well, we can try reducing it down somewhere between 330, 220, and 150 or so. And most students are able to finish this off in 20 minutes, but I do want to talk about how I grade this. What I do is, since these switches are mapped to keys A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, what I want you to do is first of all, work through it and see if you can make each of the numbers 0 through 9. But I want you to be able to use this quickly. So when I come to pass this off, what I want to do is give you a symbol, and you're not allowed to touch the keyboard until you are sure of all of the letters, all of the keys you're going to press in rapid succession to make the letter. You can think as long as you want, but don't touch those keys unless you can do it really fast, like boom, 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 boom. BCFG, for example, for a 4. And so I will ask you to make some symbol. And it won't be predictable, but since you'll be able to hear me talking to other students, you can actually practice the ones that I tell them to try. So, for example, I might say small h or upside down 4. And you can think about it as long as you want, and then boom, 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 put that in your keyboard. If it comes up, great. If not, we'll try again a little bit later. So that's basically it. Thank you for watching. Aaron Jerome, Jerome Electronics. I'll talk to you next time.